Not really. I don't know, Mom really. I don't want to say. Nah, they don't share bad news. Like 45 isn't too bad. No, I bet you're like lying to like 5 yards. 5 yards? Okay. I know, I'm just kidding. It's gonna be a breeze from. You're about to hit it. Now you gotta. So, see ya. Yeah. See ya. But it's not an economic. Yes, sir. You just paying for shipping. What I need a card. I'm gonna buy this or something. It comes up with 2 cents away. And so then I bought a $3 ticket for each.
No, maybe, yeah. Like June. It's
And I thought,
I don't know that some effort is outside the president.
Okay. Good morning. Welcome back. Let's go ahead and get rolling today. Hope your week has been going well. And we are moving right along in week number 5, getting into the theory today of groupthink. So last class, we talked about CPMT. You can think about this as the Spider-Man or superhero theory, where we talk about how people preserve and protect various secrets that they might or might not share interpersonally. We heard from Ryan in terms of sharing and talking about some practical examples and complications related to this theory, particularly as it related to challenges in family relationships. So there's a concept here that involves experiencing discomfort related to experiencing, sharing, and revealing private information. This is the idea of turbulence, right? So in a relationship, we encounter a variety of forms of turbulence that impact how we might choose to share and reveal that information. So today is getting into groupthink. We'll talk about its relevance, its applicability to organizations and groups. And then we'll have Raviti, who will be sharing an outside source, talking about this a little bit further. Just as a quick heads up, so we took some time in our last couple of classes to help with brainstorming and preparation for your application paper number 1 that's soon to be Sunday. We'll kind of focusing more in the class on these upcoming theories, but I do encourage if you have ideas, let me know if you need an extension. Let me know by Monday if you feel that will help you in pacing yourself in some of the other tasks. And I'm happy to discuss further any ideas that you might have or look at a rough draft, so long as you submit that to me a week from Friday. Not required, but might be useful as you're starting to think about this assignment. So today we're going to be talking about groupthink, which is very commonly discussed major theory with a whole lot of applications, use cases, and things to think about here. A lot of the theories that we've been talking about have been primarily talking about interpersonal communication between two people, or have been talking about media, such as agenda setting theory. But this one's a little bit different. This is much more closely tied to small groups. So folks who have taken small group communication in the past are likely familiar with this theory to an extent. But groupthink is a very important theory, not so much for it being a pair of glasses that we can use to look at the world and better understand it, although it does that too, but for helping us understand what not to do and a lot of the problems that can come out as a result of some of the ways that we communicate and engage with one another. So groupthink is a really useful, applicable, and relevant theory in addressing problems that emerge in group settings. So this theory is predicated off of the drive for getting along and consensus that we experience in a group setting. You're in a group with other people, maybe for a class, maybe teammates on an athletic team or extracurricular. Maybe you have coworkers that you're involved with, right? And because you interact with them regularly, you spend a lot of time with them, you are very incentivized to get along with them. And what does that mean? Well, oftentimes we're going to work together. One way of thinking about this is you're going out with your friends and you're trying to decide where to go to eat. Maybe you're indecisive because you don't want to suggest something that other people in the group don't like. They say, I don't know, what do you want, right? I'm open to whatever, and you have a problem where nobody's willing to be decisive and actually make the decision as to where to go, because everybody wants to go with the flow and support other people. That can be a challenge that we see in that context, our desire for consensus, our desire to not step on anybody's toes. But one challenge that comes in highly cohesive and connected groups is that we don't always consider doing things differently or taking actions that go away from our established way of doing things. We've done this in the past. We'll do it again, right? Every Friday, we go out to the local and get some ice cream, right? Perhaps if you're a group that has worked well in the past, you have a certain way of doing things, interacting and working together. One challenge that emerges is that as a result of groups being similar and adopting similar beliefs and approaches, they don't necessarily take in or accept views that go outside of what the group has accepted or done in the past, right? So oftentimes, if you're in a group, they are less likely to share unpopular opinions or contrasting perspectives. If you are in a group that's considering who to hire for a job, right? And everybody says, oh, we should hire candidate A because they're the best, and you're the one person who wants to hire candidate B, you're less likely to actually share, actually, I feel like candidate B is better. Here's why. You're more likely to go with the flow and say, yeah, sure, let's do it, candidate A, right? So oftentimes, if we have a dissimilar viewpoint, we're more willing to self-censor, not share that viewpoint, because we don't want to rock the boat or put a spotlight under us or risk the cohesion of the group. So self-censorship is really common. As a result of this, we have the issue of groupthink. That is, groups make decisions that at times can be premature, can have a lot of problems that are not well thought out, and that don't necessarily invite outside perspectives. That is, by not sharing or expressing your concerns or viewpoint on an issue and just allowing the group to move down a path, that group essentially leads toward a really bad decision. There's a lot of examples of groupthink that I bring up, examples I've talked about in other classes. I've talked, for instance, about the Space Shuttle Challenger disaster in the 1980s. I've talked about a really cringe Pepsi ad featuring, I think it's Kylie Kendall. I get the Jenners, whatever, mixed up. But it's one of them who is there's this scene of this very kind of tense situation involving protests and the police. And how do we solve that? Oh, we get a Pepsi. We offer a Pepsi to a police officer, and suddenly the conflict's over. So that was seen as a really bad ad because it was very seen as not sensitive to the issues that were happening at the time. Pepsi's not going to solve issues of unrest and violence in the country. So that'd be another example. How is an advertisement portrayed, circulated, and how did it get there when it had that many problems? It was seen as that much of an issue. There's also a lot of foreign policy examples that we could draw upon as well. For example, the Vietnam War, Bay of Pigs invasion of Iraq, withdrawal from Afghanistan, you name it. There have been a lot of major issues that have happened in foreign policy as well as domestic policies, such as companies and groups. But one example that I wanted to really spotlight for today is an experiment that you might be familiar with, especially if you've taken a course in psychology or anthropology, sociology. How many people have heard of the Stanford Prison Experiment before? Okay, so several of you. We'll be reviewing it and we'll be talking about it in the context of groupthink specifically. So if you haven't heard of it, this will be a great crash course. If you have, groupthink, I think helps to shed light on some of the issues that came up in this session. So this is a really useful theory as we're thinking about our own lives, our own experiences, and the challenges that we navigate day to day. This theory matters for a lot of reasons. First of all, we find ourselves in groups, whether we like it or not. We've got coworkers, we've got teammates, we've got friends, we've got family members, right? We find ourselves drawn to group settings for a variety of reasons. And when we're in those group settings, we've got to make decisions, right? What kind of strategy is our team doing? We're in like a D&D guild, right? What is the campaign? How we're going to go about, solving the campaign? If you play like an online game, right? Similar set of decisions. So professionally, personally, leisurely, we are making decisions all the time in a group setting. But the impacts of group decisions can have a lot of problems. They can be really significant. Who are you hiring for a job? Are you going to win or lose a game? What are you doing socially in your groups? Those are important decisions to make. And one major goal in a lot of careers is trying to understand how to facilitate and work effectively in groups. If you're applying for a job, chances are if this job involves any type of professional engagement or team engagement, you're going to be asked a question about your ability to work effectively with teams. And one of the things that a lot of employers look for are people who are navigating issues including those groupthink. They don't want a group member who's just going to say yes to everything and go along with the group, even if the group is like lemming hanging off a cliff. Right? If you're familiar, right, this metaphor is used to describe a lemming sees another lemming jump off a cliff and it does it too. You see what other people are doing and you choose to do it even if what other people are doing is destructive. Oh, other people in the group seem to think that this advertisement is just fine, so I approve it too, right? So at times in groups, your perception of issues can be somewhat warped because people are confirming each other's views, but you don't have the outside influence or the contrasting views that can help put this into perspective. And this theory helps us to explain and understand a lot of major problems, issues, disasters, failures that have happened as a result of poor group decision making. Again, you might not necessarily be in charge of US foreign policy, but you certainly have a lot of settings where you'll be placed in groups and asked to make group decisions. So this theory helps us to understand how we can do that better. This theory comes from Urban Janus, who is a psychologist and researcher at Yale, concerned on groupthink in a political context. So again, a lot of its origins are in terms of public policy, particularly foreign policy. So while it has its start there, it's very closely connected to communication, because how do groups work? Well, they communicate. And how do groups arrive at decisions? Well, they communicate. So communication can be a good way to understand the dynamics of groupthink more generally. So groupthink comes with a variety of different assumptions and beliefs that guide its overall organization. One of them is that when you are put into a group, generally speaking, there is a drive for cohesiveness. By cohesiveness, we mean that members of the group are getting along, they're generally in harmony, they're generally in agreement when it comes to making decisions. The reason for this is time, right? If you are in a group for an hour and your goal at the end of the group is to decide who you're going to hire for this job, you don't want to sit there for 3 hours and not come to any decisions, right? You don't want to feel like your group is ineffective and not reaching the solutions to the issues that it needs to. So groups oftentimes are going to make shortcuts to get through things quickly, and cohesiveness is a big part of that. We also know that a lot of disagreement, a lot of frustrations in groups and interpersonal conflict can make us really unhappy, have a lot of major mental and psychological consequences. So what do? We try to keep our groups pretty harmonious. We try to get along. Groups generally solve problems in a pretty unified way. If you're working in a small group, there's a good chance that you are most interested in seeking out consensus. That is, at the end of the day, everybody agrees, or at least is willing to agree on the outcome. If you have a group of 3 people, right, you're typically not going to say, oh, we're going to go out to this restaurant because 2 out of 3 said that we should. And even though the 3rd one can't eat anything because, you know, they have celiac, whatever, 2 out of 3 rules, majority rules, right? We're generally not going to say that because that can be pretty insensitive to the 3rd person. So we're compelled to try to work together and find something that works for people together. So you can think about cohesiveness as kind of like, you know, like a scarf or some type of like knitted or woven fabric where, you know, the different pieces are connected really closely to each other. And groups make decisions oftentimes in complex ways. They've got a lot of factors to consider. They've got a lot of variables they have to put into something. If you're interviewing somebody for a job, you have to consider the interview, the quality of their material, quality of their references. There's so much that goes into how groups might arrive at a decision, right? If you're, for instance, like, you know, you are making a movie, you have to consider not only the people on set, you have to consider, you know, executive producers. There's a lot of pressures that go into the process of making decisions as we find ourselves in groups. So some key ideas, again, cohesiveness is the willingness of people in a group to work together. There is what's known as affiliative constraints, which is a cornerstone here of the problem of groupthink. So if you're doing an application paper about groupthink, you would really want to draw from affiliative constraints here, because this is the idea that when faced with sharing a dissenting view, a view that disagrees with the group, or just choosing not to talk at all, or share a perspective that agrees with the group, oftentimes we're going to be more compelled not to express our opinion, go with the flow, you know, not offer any comments. Again, if you want to get through a meeting quickly and everybody wants to hire candidate A, you're not typically going to say, oh, I want to hire candidate B. You're not going to share a view that disagrees with the group. And in so doing, you would be practicing the affiliative constraints. There's the idea of homogeneity. In other words, birds of a feather, people in groups tend to exhibit or develop similarities in terms of their background. This can come from oftentimes people recruiting or hiring people into groups that have similarities to them. If you have a group of friends, there's a good chance that you and your friends have a few things in common that, you know, really unite the group. And over time, as groups get to know each other better, they might find that their viewpoints and perspectives are pretty similar. And lastly, groups are oftentimes developing a sense of insulation. Because your only framework are other people in the group about group's decisions, and because members of the group might choose to censor and not share information publicly, they become put in a little bit of a bubble, right? So sometimes what a group or agency thinks is going to be a great ad that's, you know, relevant and socially responsive to the issues is actually terrible to the general public. But the group doesn't know this because the group only has each other to figure out this decision with, and everybody in the group is signing off on this, right? So being insulated and cut off from the outside world is a problem that a lot of small groups encounter too. So there's a few conditions that create groupthink and are common in situations that arise here. Irving Janis brought up a lot of examples when he was looking at sort of the failures on foreign and domestic policy of a lot of political leaders, and found 3 key through lines here, right? One of them is the high cohesiveness of decision-making in the group, right? So in other words, the group is very closely connected. They make decisions together. Perhaps they use consensus to make decisions where all members of the group ultimately need to reach some kind of agreement. Which compels people in the group to agree, even if they really don't. Specific conditions of the environment in which the group functions are important. For example, perhaps the group is under a time crunch and they are trying to reach a decision as quickly as possible. Another structural condition that can happen in the group is recognizing, trying to meet a deadline for their boss. Sometimes a structural condition can be they're experiencing a variety of pressures. We've got to get this out. There's crunch to get something done. And there's also stressful characteristics of the situation that can be both internal and external. I hate this group. We hate each other. I just want to get this project over with so that I don't have to think about this anymore, right? Or external characteristics. This was really prevalent in the Challenger disaster, where there was a lot of pressure for scientists to develop and launch the rocket, even though the rocket wasn't thoroughly tested and the rocket blew up within a few seconds. So a lot of factors here, the combination of pressure, the combination of self-censorship, lead to situations in which groups are making poor decisions. So there are a variety of symptoms that we see here where if we look at a situation, we can understand that groupthink is happening in this context, right? It's kind of I think, a telling visual. Diversity is good, pass it down, right? But the demographics in the group are clearly not very diverse. So one symptom here is concurrence seeking. It's not that reaching consensus is bad. In fact, it can be really good as a way of making sure that all parties are being represented, heard, and considered in the process. But the question you have to ask yourself when you're put into a group that you're leading or following in a group is this real consensus? Are people in the group really getting along, and do they really feel this way? Or have you created a setting in which people who might disagree don't want to share their disagreement? They might not feel safe or comfortable disagreeing. They might worry about the consequences of disagreeing. They might worry about holding up the group. So you have to ask yourself if there is genuine consensus or artificial consensus. Another thing that's very common, groupthink, is a more general idea known as the third person effect. We see this in a lot of other settings, including advertising. It's the idea that, an advertisement, media, that impacts other people. It changes other people's minds, but doesn't change mine. I'm immune. I'm not impacted by this, right? And one of the issues that we notice is that typically we tend to underestimate how we're impacted and overestimate how other people are impacted. It's not going to happen to me. And this happens in group settings, right? Oftentimes, a group might say, yeah, we're aware of group things. There can be problems in how groups work, but we're not one of those groups. We're one of the cool groups. We don't have that issue happen. They believe that they're invulnerable to groupthink, maybe because everybody speaks their mind, they're independent, they have the ability to disagree. For whatever reason, the group thinks that groupthink is not affecting them, and they believe that ultimately the group's going to do the right thing. Well, if somebody disagreed, they would share, they would talk about it, right? They believe that the group is well-intentioned in that regard, and therefore there won't be any problems. Closed-mindedness is another issue here, right? One way that closed-mindedness happens is out-group stereotyping, right? Saying, oh, well, other people who are not a part of the group, they just don't get it. They don't get what we do, right? So if you're working in a team, maybe you have some critique from an outside member and they say, I don't know about this project. It seems a little weird. I don't think it'll be a good fit. And you say, oh, well, they don't know what they're talking about, right? So if you stereotype or categorize people outside of your group as not knowledgeable about the issue, that can be a really big problem. Also, as a group, you can collectively rationalize. Well, yeah, our last project didn't go well, or our last game didn't go well. That was because, Larry had a foot injury. It was other factors that went into that, right? Not taking responsibility for how the group might be impacted by the decision. And then lastly, another key symptom here of groupthink is that there is a pressure toward uniformity, right, of people in the group getting along. That is, people are pressured to self-censor because if you disagree, people gasp, people are frustrated, it's a waste of time. People believe that there is unanimous agreement among people in the group, even if there's not. Maybe person number 5 did not want to go get, dinner over at Raoul's because they didn't want that, right? But they chose to self-censor. The presence of self-appointed mind guards, right? So mind guards refer to how we mentally essentially rationalize or protect ourselves. So for instance, saying, people in the other group don't understand, or, this was a fluke, this is not going to happen again. And another thing is to directly pressure dissenters, right? We're all in agreement, right? Right? We can get this agenda item over with and get out of the meeting, right? That can be a way where you're technically allowing people to disagree, but you're not really giving them the option to do so without compromising the reputation of the group. Like, oh, well, I have something to say that I disagree with. And then everybody in the group sighs and they're frustrated, right? Because people want to reach a decision, they want to get out, they want to get done, they want to use their time better. They feel frustrated when that disagreement might be expressed. So there are a lot of measures that can be taken to address groupthink effectively. One of them is to create oversight and control over the meeting in such a way that disagreement is facilitated. One of the best ways this can happen is to use something such as, an anonymous survey or straw poll before the meeting starts. Say, you and your friends are trying to decide where to go for dinner, and like everybody alerts the first thing that comes to mind, right? That way they're not influenced by each other. They can express their own independent opinion, right? Or perhaps a group is trying to decide who to hire for a job, and everybody anonymously shares their preference first before people have the chance to talk about it together. So organizing the meeting in such a way that encourages disagreement and allows people to express their views is important if you're leading, managing, or facilitating group settings. Whistleblowing, right? That can be really important. One way you can do this is to invite people outside of the group to participate, sit in, and offer their thoughts. If you're working on a school project and you have somebody like a roommate or friend who was not in on the group and you share the work, then they have an outside perspective they can bring to the table and say, hey, I don't think that this is working so well. Here's some suggestions that I have for you, right? So allowing outside perspectives to share their views can be really useful. Opening up and letting people object and disagree, right? Showing that you're in a setting where people can express their opinions openly. And in fact, at times, encouraging that can be useful too. For example, if you're leading or managing a group, one thing you can do is actually task somebody with playing devil's advocate. Their job is to be obnoxious and to, suggest a contrasting perspective whenever possible so that perspective can be included in the conversation. So that's another thing we can think about here. And also, when you're in a small group, right, groups are arriving at decisions on different bases. Sometimes consensus, but sometimes people are not always going to totally agree. And sometimes making a majority rule decision or a compromise can be a better approach rather than projecting a false consensus on the group. The opposite of groupthink that can sometimes emerge in some group settings is what's known as polythink, where generally speaking, there's a lot of yelling, there's a lot of frustration, it's very loud, there's a lot of open disagreement, and people are sharing their perspectives in a very open setting. While expressing views from a variety of perspectives can be good, polythink takes this to an extreme that can be detrimental because nobody's in agreement, there's no cohesion, there's no agreement at all. People find themselves, really dealing with a stressful and difficult environment. So the challenge is to navigate people expressing their perspective, but not doing so to an extent that is destructive to the overall. So groupthink has a few critiques here. One of the critiques of groupthink is that groupthink only really impacts groups that are making decisions. That is, you're part of an organization that has to arrive at and reach a decision. It doesn't really get at other aspects of group behavior and dynamics of the group, just at how members of the group reach those decisions overall. It's a theory that makes a lot of sense, right? It explains a lot of behavior, but generally speaking, it doesn't have a whole lot of terms or concepts or ideas to draw from. It makes sense, but it's difficult to kind of zoom out and explain it as an overall theory when it's describing human behavior. And it also ties to some of the challenges in testability. This is a theory that can be difficult to apply, to use, to analyze, because a lot of the ways that groupthink has been used has been in looking at historical and empirical examples, right? It's very hard for anyone to test a thing that somebody didn't say or a decision that they didn't make. It's a lot easier to test what people have said and have done. And how do you measure those outside variables of what hasn't really been said or done? That can be very challenging. So all that to say, it's a useful theory. It's been used in a lot of contexts and applied both within and well outside of the study of communication, and adds a lot to our understanding of small groups and overall communication theory, but it's not immune to criticism. So with that being said, we have our class presentation of the day. So we will get rolling on that. And then after that, I have an application and we'll do a group activity. All right.
Okay, so my presentation is about, the article is called Group Decision Fiascos Continue, Space Shuttle Challenger and a Revised Grouping Framework. So for some background info, it's basically about the shuttle that exploded because people didn't listen to the advising about how it was really dangerous to launch it in the first place. And what happened was the temperature that day was really low. And they shouldn't have launched it, but they still did because of groupthink. And a lot of it is because of the defectiveness of the group thinking process. So key ideas to start off. The first one was, despite research and knowledge about groupthink, its symptoms and consequences are still felt in modern times. So this is what the article opened with. And I thought it was important because despite what we know and what we're still learning about groupthink, it's still obviously prevalent, and it's hard to think about it when it's happening, but after the fact, we can look back and dissect what went wrong. And then the article's prime example is obviously the Space Shuttle Challenger and the explosion that unfortunately killed 7 astronauts. And what happened was, the evidence when they investigated this was that there was a heavily flawed decision-making process. So a large part of that process was groupthink and what they did wrong in the process. And then harmony and loyalty within the group hindered the need for rational thinking and decision-making. So this means that, which I'll get into later, but people in the group were so close that they felt like they didn't need other outside perspectives for it. So they kind of trusted each other so much that they decided to go along with the launching. And then lastly, the 3 conditions of groupthink that play into this are cohesive group, leader preference, and insulation. And these are the things that basically were flawed in the defective decision-making, and it's what caused them to launch it and then blew up after. So the 3 conditions were basically my connection to the groupthink. First of all, cohesive group is what I talked about, kind of about how everyone in the group was really close and they didn't feel the need for outside perspectives. And it signifies the loyalty and pride amongst them because they just trusted each other so much that they thought it was okay to launch the shuttle. And yeah, so even if they had individual self-doubts about it, they kind of thought, oh, well, if she thinks it's okay, then I should too. And they just went along with it. And then condition 2 was leader preference. So 2 of the top level managers kept pushing for the launch of the shuttle. So this was also due to external forces because the public really wanted the shuttle to be launched because it was a really historical moment. But the leaders, the 2 top level managers, they didn't even listen to the evidence that was provided. And they decided to go along with it. And then that brings me to condition 3, which is insulation from experts. So obviously engineers were involved with the project because it's with the shuttle and they know all the technicalities and everything. But the thing is, their opinions and concerns were pushed aside because no one really wanted to listen. And there was data saying that the temperature was way too low for the safe launching, but no one sat down with them to listen to the data. And I'm loosely quoting this, but there was an engineer that said the only time anyone ever sat down to look at the data was during a lunch break, which no one shows up to work during lunch break. So I thought that was interesting. So basically the basis of all this is that top level people knew of objections from engineers, but they didn't address their concerns or review that data with them. And overall, the knowledge I gained from this was basically that groupthink is still prevalent, regardless of how much we know or can learn about it. And it sucks that kind of when you are experienced groupthink, you don't know that you are. But I think that it's really a good tool to look back and dissect what went wrong in decision-making processes. And I also thought it was cool that it plays a role in scientific and psychological reasonings because it explains human behavior on a deeper level. And we can basically know about how people act the way they do and why they go along with wrong decision making. And that's why we're excited.
Thank you so much, Phoebe, for getting us thinking about and understanding groupthink in a really practical context. This example of the Challenger disaster is a really great example of applying and understanding this theory, right? In the 1980s, part of very much the space race and Reagan's push at the time toward getting this rocket launched, as you pointed out really well, right? The way that this data was not being shared until like a lunch break, and the way that a leader is insulating the group because perhaps expressions of dissent or disagreement are shared in a group, but the leader isn't allowing that to influence the decision making. They aren't like factoring in people's disagreement or concern into the group, which I think adds a layer of nuance to groupthink too. It's not only that members of the group self-censor, it's that even if a member of the group openly expresses their opinion, that group member doesn't have the power for that decision to impact the group in a meaningful way. Another thing to think about here connected to that is that a lot of times, if a group leader tips their hand a bit too much and they show that they have a particular opinion or perspective on the group, generally speaking, members of the group are going to be more likely to go with what the leader wants. So if you find yourself ever involved in leading a group that involves decision making, one thing that you can do is to avoid expressing your opinion early on, let other people express their views and bring your perspective in later. Because oftentimes people are going to just share what they think the leader wants to hear. But Challenger explosion and its consequences, right, not only killed many astronauts, but it also left the United States and NASA at a point where it really hasn't fully recovered in terms of space exploration and work, right? So it's an important example and application of this theory. I want to look at another application that's useful here. Again, this was one that you all might be familiar with, but I do think getting into this in more detail is useful using the framework of groupthink here. In particular, the Stanford Prison Experiment is useful to understand both in terms of self-censorship and mind guards that allowed the experiment to continue, right? This was an incredibly unethical and hurtful experiment that had major psychological and ethical consequences, and yet it persisted for multiple days despite concerns that members of the group might have. And within the experiment itself, we see another example of groupthink in terms of the behavior and practices that people did as participants in this experiment too, in part being rationalized because that's what other people in the group were doing. So I wanted to share a short clip from this that gets into some of the details about the study and some of the ways that it can connect to some key ideas in groupthink.
In 2015, the Stanford Prison Experiment was released in theaters. The movie detailed the infamous 1971 experiment in which 24 college students were put in prison. Now, while the experiment was supposed to last for 2 weeks, it was terminated after 6 days due to psychological effects that it was having on both the guards and the prisoners. So what actually happened during the Stanford Prison Experiment? Why is it so infamous? And does the movie get everything right, or is it just a dramatization? This video will briefly explain the experiment, its impact on the world of psychology, and the controversy that it's facing 45 years in the future. So first off, what is the Stanford Prison Experiment? After Milgram's experiment rocked the world of psychology, many people were left with questions about obedience, power dynamics, and the abuse of power. Philip Zimbardo, a professor at Stanford, wanted to then explore these questions further. And with the grants from the Navy, Zimbardo set up something called the Stanford Prison Experiment. He wanted to see, could a person's role influence their behavior? Zimbardo and his team interviewed 70 applicants at Stanford who were willing to participate in the study for 14 days and receive $15 a day. They wanted to make sure that they chose the brightest and the most mentally sound participants. And after narrowing down their applicants to 24, the researchers flipped the coin and assigned the roles. Half of the participants would be prisoners, and the other half would be guards. And the researchers then set up a basement at Stanford to make it look like a real prison. They were very serious about treating the experiment like a simulation. Prisoners were actually arrested in public and taken into prison. They were even booked, fingerprinted, and strip searched. Now, Zimbardo's team also gave prisoners numbers that were meant to be used instead of their real name. They claimed that it would help give the prisoners a sense of anonymity and help the experiment. Guards had pretty much free reign over how they could treat the prisoners, while they had two main rules. They could not hit the prisoners, and they could not put prisoners in solitary confinement for more than an hour. Philip Zimbardo played the role of the prison superintendent. His graduate students and research partners also played roles as members of the parole board and prison warden. Prisoners were tasked with certain activities like writing a letter home to their visitors and making a case to the parole board about why they should be let off. Guards also subjected the prisoners to counts in which they forced the prisoners to do jumping jacks, push-ups, and other degrading tasks. Now, it did not take long for these guards to start to abuse their power. Within one day, a guard actually hit one of the prisoners with his nightstick. On the second day, the prisoners tried to rebel, and so their heads were taken away. To punish these prisoners, the guards shot a fire extinguisher into the cell. Guards used physical and psychological abuse, including things like sleep deprivation, to punish and intimidate the prisoners throughout the study. The prisoners were forced to wear dressings and stocking caps the whole time. And at some point, the guards would put bags over the prisoners' heads. And since the study has ended, it has since been compared to actions at the Abu Ghraib Detention Center. Zimbardo has written about the case and its parallels to the prison experiment since. So why did this experiment get shut down? Well, very quickly, the guards started to abuse their power. The prisoners started to spiral. On the third day, prisoner number 8612 started to cry and scream uncontrollably. He threatened to harm himself and call a lawyer. To avoid potential psychological damage or a lawsuit, he was let go. Two other prisoners were let go in the next 2 days. One actually refused to eat. And on the fifth day, Zimbardo's girlfriend, which was actually his former student, came to visit the experiment. Zimbardo and his team had been monitoring the experiment and playing their roles in it 24/7. And when she saw the horrors that was going on in the prison, she asked Zimbardo to end the experiment immediately. She even threatened to break up with him. Well, eventually on the sixth day, he ended the experiment.
So this experiment persisted for a long time, right? And it wasn't until an outside perspective went in and said, this is awful, this is terrible, you've got to end this, that they were willing to end it, right? So showing us how people involved in the experiment, some of the wardens, right, and people in the study found themselves so ingrained in something that was hurtful, that was abusive, and yet despite this, the experiment continued. And it wasn't until an outside whistleblower that could be fully addressed. We also saw, right, very quickly, the behavior and actions that the guards took in this study were considered really unethical, really hurtful to the group. Guards continued to do that out of groupthink, out of a need to appease other members of the study who were doing the same thing. And nobody stopped after, like, again, a lot of the stuff that went on, this was like day 1, day 2, day 3, and yet it continued. And people didn't like call out or end it. Some people left, but the experiment persisted until somebody came in. And, you know, if Zimbardo's girlfriend / former student, which is its own problem for a number of reasons, didn't come in and express this, I don't know how long that would have continued. Probably would have gone on longer. Again, showing us some of the practical problems with groupthink. Incidentally, this experiment gave rise to a lot of the ethical standards we do in research. So if you're ever doing research that involves human subjects, like an interview, you have to go through an institutional review board, and they review the study to ensure that the study you're doing is ethical and minimizes harm to participants because of the study. So I'm going to be splitting you all into groups, and for your attendance activity for today, I'm going to ask you and your group members to consider you're hiring a candidate for a photographer job. You're interviewing several people for this position. First of all, what are some strategies that your group can do to avoid groupthink? And second of all, how might the leader of the group help to facilitate open expression and disagreement? So the rows over here will be a group of 5. Rows over here in the middle will also be a group of 5. We'll do a group of 4 in the front 2 rows up here, and then a group of 4 in the back rows over here. Take some time, have one person write or type with names as the leader of the group. Chat with each other about possible strategies that you all can use. And we'll bring that together in just a little bit.
My name is Paul. So Yeah. More. One thing. That's good one was just having an office. So you can say why. Yeah.
Yeah.
Everyone's their own. I'll say I was leader. So. I feel I don't know. As a keeper, you're all making stuff out. And then after that. No, I didn't like the one. I know first. Yeah. Whether they
We've got 3 more minutes. You can hear your idea.
Like if there were,
Yeah.
especially. So it's loud.
Go ahead and finish your discussions. All right, let's chat about this together. Why don't we start with the group on this side? What was the strategy you came up with to avoid or address groupthink for this process? Mhm. Yeah. So writing down first impressions, allowing people to share their starting viewpoint, right? It's okay if your viewpoint changes, but making sure that people have the ability to express their honest opinions going in, rather than the opinions that are motivated by the group. What's another strategy to avoid groupthink from this group here in the middle?
We discussed, like, since it's like photographers, you can lay out like pieces of their art and then everybody kind of like separately come up with like their opinions on it. And cool up with to share it.
Yeah.
That way it's like, see all the work and that way you can like have your own discussion with yourself and your and make sure that you're still surrounded yourself with it within the art.
Yeah. So giving everybody time and space to express their perspective can be really useful here, right? Oftentimes people feel like they can't get a word in edgewise, they have an opinion or perspective that they don't feel they have the space to share, and that can address that. How about the activities of a leader of a group to avoid groupthink? What did you all say?
As a leader, you kind of felt like you're obligated to both say why you're for a given candidate and also play devil's advocate to express both sides of their opinion, and probably do that towards the end after everyone's had a chance to express their opinion. That way you allow the group to formulate their own opinion rather than you say, oh, I like this candidate, and kind of push the group one way or the other.
Yeah. So a leader has got to be accountable. They've got to be accountable for why they feel a certain way, and also accountable for understanding and engaging with opposing perspectives, rather than my way or that way. And then how about back here? What was another strategy that a leader could do?
We said making it an open discussion. Of what we want. From one perspective, we talk. Just one, even if broad and use that.
One challenge that can happen in a lot of group settings, right, is you have a dominator of the group who's taking charge, who's taking over, and doing all of the work. And pushing away from that can be a really effective strategy by encouraging other perspectives and views that don't get the same amount of time to talk on. So thank you for your thoughts and perspectives here. Again, groupthink is a useful theory in a lot of practical and applied settings. So we've talked a little bit about groupthink and some of the challenges of addressing groupthink effectively. Next class, we will have a presentation from Lily in discussing organizational culture theory. So please pass forward or email your group's work. Make sure your group member names are on it. Have a great rest of your day and see you again on Friday.
I'm not gonna be here Friday.
Okay.
That's it. So with the absent, you said there's like a makeup assignment.